This is Segundo, and he's a desert tortoise. They're an endangered species in the United States, so they're protected by federal law. He's as large as he's going to get, and he's probably not quite midlife. These guys can live 60 to 80 years, possibly longer. Not real good data on that yet. This guy, Segundo, is probably about 20, getting close to 20 years old. They are desert animals, hence the name. So they spend much of their day in burrows that they dig underground, just kind of getting out of the day's heat. And then they're most active dawn and dusk and in the morning. They are herbivores primarily, so they're eating desert plants and fruits and grasses. And they spend most of their daytime searching for those foods, although they do have a definite home range and they do return to the same burrow pretty much every night. They are reptiles, so they're egg layers and cold-blooded, and they can have a clutch of 10 to 20 eggs at one time. And then as far as the other neat adaptations about desert tortoises, one of the ways they deal with the desert environment is by storing water in these sacs inside their body. So they can have at least short-term water storage that they will take care of themselves. So they do, if they find a water source, they will kind of drink as much as they possibly can hold to get them through to the next time. They've got very stubby toes and claws, but that are very adapted to digging in the dirty dirt and rock and sand and gravel in a desert environment. And then broadside here, it is true that with tortoises and turtles, the myth is always that you can count their shells and tell how old they are, the different scales on their shell. That's not true, but what is true, and these guys are good examples of it, is you can see they have a lot of rings on each scale. You can count those rings and get an estimate of their age, because they shed those rings about once every 12 to 16, 18 months, and every time they shed it, it'll have a new ring, kind of like the ring on a tree. So you can get a size estimate from them that way, but you typically can't get an exact age that way. So they are an endangered species. Became endangered primarily due to changes in their environment and also human predation. They were sometimes hunted for their meat. And their numbers, though, have rebounded. There's actually a Desert Tortoise Association that has formed specifically to protect these guys. So they are a species that is getting some remediation, and their numbers have actually been growing over the past few years, so they're doing much better. This is a lineous two-toed sloth. They are a species that are found in the rainforests of Central America and into South America, but more just the northern parts of South America. They are an entirely arboreal species, so living entirely in the trees. The only time they really come to the ground is to get from tree to tree if they have to kind of cross to a different section of trees. But in the rainforest that doesn't occur very often. They will also come down to the ground occasionally to defecate. Their food is plants and leaves and fruits off of the trees that they're living in. Often regarded as the world's slowest mammal. That's kind of up for debate though, and actually these guys can have a range of as big as 10 acres. So they have a fairly large range for an animal that's so slow. One of their most famous adaptations you hear people talking about is the algae that grows in their fur. They actually are so slow that algae grows on them, and they gives them a green cast or a tint to their color often, which helps them camouflage in the trees. Another unusual thing about sloths is they're the only mammals that have fur that starts from their belly and grows towards their back. Most mammals, if you think of most mammals, the fur kind of starts on their back and kind of hangs off to the sides towards their belly. These guys, their fur does the opposite. And it's because they do spend the majority of their time hanging what would be kind of upside down to us. They do have teeth, and they will kind of slowly and methodically chew their food. And they also have very long hooked claws, and that's how they can kind of grapple their way among the trees. And as their name implies, they have 2 claws on their front feet. There are also 3-toed sloths that have 3 claws, and it's one of the main distinguishing features for the different species of sloth that there is. These are kinkajou, and kinkajou are a South American species. They're an animal that lives high up in the trees. They rely on their feet, which have kind of long toes and long feet for grasping branches. And they also have a prehensile tail, so a tail that can grab onto things, and that's how they maneuver around in the tree. They're sometimes called honey bears because they've got kind of a fur that's honey colored. And they have a bear-like looking face, but they're not related to bears, nor are they related to monkeys. They are related to raccoons, or kind of the closest relatives they would have. These guys are primarily fruit eaters, so they're in the wild, they're eating figs and just mangoes and those types of fruits. They will also eat some flowers, and they will occasionally eat mammals and birds and bird eggs as well. So they will eat some protein, so they're not listed strictly as herbivores, but the herbivore plant matter does make up the bulk of their diet. In captivity, these guys are fairly long-lived. In zoos, they can live 30 years or so, 35 years. Our oldest one right now is about 25 years old. But in the wild, their wild lifespan is thought to be in the 20 to 25 range. And they are full-grown. So the individuals we have are as large as they're going to get. They do pair up and mate. They live in relatively solitary, except for mating pairs and the young that the female might have with her for part of the year. These are Egyptian fruit bats, and they are members of the Old World grouping of bats. Egyptian fruit bats are really cool because they are of the larger fruit-eating bats. They're the only ones that are cave dwellers. So most fruit-eating bats that live in South America, Africa, and places like that tend to live up in trees because that's where their food is, and they don't need to hibernate. They don't need the warmth and the shelter that a cave provides like these smaller bats that live in the United States do. So these guys are found in Egypt and pretty much all throughout Africa, and they're, like I said, unique in that they live in caves even though they're fruit-eating bats. They have other things that are pretty unique to them too. All bats can use and do echolocation. Most fruit-eating bats, though, don't really use it very often because their food doesn't move. They're eating fruit that's hanging in a tree, so they can see it and they can fly right to it and eat it, and they don't need to echolocate to find their food. Egyptian fruit bats, because they live in caves, they do echolocate when they're in the caves, and then once they come out and they're foraging for food, they don't really echolocate. They're the only bats that have an echolocation, the noise they emit. They're the only bats that the noise is emitted in a range that human ears can hear it unaided. So they have machines that you can use to kind of hear. They can hear frequencies human ears can't hear. Human ears cannot hear. With these guys, you don't need those machines, though. They actually echolocate at a range we can actually hear it. They, of course, are mammals, and they're flying mammals. So their wings, really their front arms and hands have been adapted into the wings. And if you stretch out a wing, you can kind of see that it's their finger bones. That is the majority of the bones that are holding together that netting of their wing. Their wings are very thin-skinned, so they do tear easily, and they actually have a pretty quick growth rate on that flap of skin that makes up their wings, so they can regrow wings pretty quickly if it tears. But of course, a torn wing, they lose the ability to fly, and they would be much more susceptible to starvation during that time period if they can't get up into a tree to find their food. So they are definitely a bad thing if they tear a wing, although it can heal fairly quickly, especially in a captive setting where they can have food brought to them. They are colony dwellers, and they can live in colonies of hundreds and hundreds of fruit bats all in the same time in the same cave. And they are, of course, nocturnal, so they leave their cave roost at night, head out into the forest, forage all night long. In the rainforest, fruit bats in general, and Egyptian fruit bats fall into this, are thought to be the primary not pollinator, but the primary means of seed dispersal for plants. They eat so much fruit, and then they defecate on the wing. So they defecate as they're flying, and as they defecate, they're dispersing seeds essentially throughout the rainforest. So bats are thought to be, even more so than birds in the rainforest setting, are thought to be the primary form of seed dispersal for rainforest trees. So they play a very prominent role in the rainforest of keeping the plant life dispersed and evenly kind of spread throughout the rainforest. So that's kind of their primary niche. Large bats like this do have predators still. Many of the larger snakes, larger hawks and owls and things like that will eat on the Egyptian fruit bat. So they aren't totally safe just because they can fly. Unlike northern bats, unlike bats in the New World or in North America, they are active year-round, so they at least don't have that hibernation period where they're even more susceptible to predation when they're basically in a kind of a stupor, where predators can grab them very easily during that time period in North America. These guys avoid that by not having to go through hibernation.